Beginning the unit on Hari and Deepti, I have this image on the board as students enter. I also pose the question, what story is this image telling? After we've discussed the image a little bit, I introduce the students to the artists. Hari and Deepti are a husband-wife artist duo. They're based in Mumbai, and they began working with paper and light in 2010. They're mostly inspired by things that they saw in their travels across Europe and Asia, in particular Balinese shadow puppets. With the Balinese shadow puppets, just to illustrate what that looks like for students that aren't familiar, we can watch a short clip. So here we can see little bits of Hari and Deepti's process. On the left, there is a sketch for the image they originally began with. On the right, you can see the box itself, and it's turned at a little bit of an angle so you get a better sense of the different layers. And usually I would not be talking over this. I would be asking students what they see, and I would have them discuss, things that look different, things that are interesting, things that stand out. For this presentation, I really want them to be looking at the different layers, figuring out how those work, and also looking at the images to see what story is being told. So here are some examples where I would be asking about the story to get them thinking about the characters in it, whether those are animals, people, the setting, forest, underwater. I would also show them these examples. They're not from Hari and Deepti. These are examples that I think are found on Etsy, other places online. And they're just showing different ways that people have used these paper boxes to create images from some of their favorite stories. I know a lot of times I've got 8th graders. They are very influenced by the media they consume, whether that's television shows, movies, books. So being able to tie it back to that can be really inspirational.
This is probably a good place to note we start with a copyright unit every year so students are aware of the issues in using other people's intellectual property.
And last, here are some images of student work from this past year. I was really happy with how the students were able to show very different stories. I had students influenced by books, by movies, and then just kind of by their own interests as well. So I end up showing them some light boxes that I have created. I have 2 here today. The first one you can see is not completely finished, but it does show the layers really well because there's no box built around it yet. Same deal with this one, in which the lights are almost burnt out, so it's difficult to see, but you can see the different layers of paper. So right now, in working on my first sketch, I've just come across a couple of things that I would want the students to consider. First of all, you are working with silhouettes. There's not going to be any drawn detail in your final image. As you can see, you're cutting out each individual piece of paper. So you want the silhouettes to be really precise. You can't just have a very basic shape. You have to really make these shapes make sense. For example, if I'm doing this panther right here, I want to be able to tell what it is. Also, making sure that your different layers aren't interfering with each other. For example, when I was drawing the trees back here, this is a Jungle Book scene. Mowgli's face, I had started doing some leaves over here, but I realized quickly that it's going to be much more impactful if I can really have this bright layer back here that then silhouettes his face, so that I don't lose these details that I'm going to work very hard to keep when I cut it out. Something else to consider with your students is how you're framing your image. I ended up creating it too far up in the frame, so I'm cutting off the bottom inch or so and I'm adding another inch on top. So keep that in mind with your paper. You do want to create a 4x6 image, but you probably want a little bit of wiggle room so that you can change the frame of your image if you need to. So once I have my final image, the next thing I need to do, I need to break it down into layers. I'm looking for the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. And for this project, I generally want students to have 5 to 6 layers. I've got my sky in the background, so I'm going to do that as layer 1.
You can either have the students put numbers on the layers, or you can have them color them in. Sometimes coloring them in different colors or different values really helps them to distinguish. So layer 1 is my background. So now I'm going to start moving into the foreground. What's the next thing that I see? I would think the next thing that I see is probably this building here in the background. So I'm going to label that number 2. And then I can see if there's anything else that I want to put on that layer in the very background. I don't think that there is. I'm going to move on. Layer 3, I think, are going to be all these trees around. So I've got trees down here. I've got trees here. And then I have this layer of trees here. Now I decided to create 2 layers of trees just for a little bit of visual interest. So I'm going to block off, disconnect these 2 pieces, and I'm going to have these trees back here be layer 3. Next, for layer 4, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the trees that are more in the foreground. So these right here. I'm also going to do this piece of ancient temple as 4 as well. So now I'm going to pause for a second because I'm looking at these vines here with these monkeys. They have to be attached to the trees somehow, but I need to decide, do I want them all on 1 layer? Do I want them on 2 different layers? I think for the depth, I'm going to do 2 different layers. So I'm going to see which vines look more like they're connected to tree layer 3, like this little guy back here, and probably these right here. And then, for example, these vines that go all the way across and connect to these trees over here, that makes more sense to put on layer 4. So I'm going to make sure that I have this. It's starting to look a little bit like color by numbers. And I'm going to try to vary this as well. So this is branch 3, this is branch 4. Next, I want to make sure that I've got my foreground. So right now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. Because I do want 5 to 6 layers for this project, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put the jaguar on 1 layer. I think it's that Bagheera, I don't remember the story. So this is all layer 5. Now I can put Mowgli on a separate layer, or I can put him on the same layer so that it looks like he's really looking here. I think I will go ahead and put him on the same layer. So these will be flush in the picture. It's also sometimes nice to have some sort of framing device that isn't just the blocky rectangular frame. So I think what I'm going to do for this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sketch in like some jungly vines in the foreground. Maybe I'm going to turn this into more of an oval. And I can even have some vines crossing the picture plane. And again, that just creates a little more depth. So I'm going to move this 5 over here. This is going to be layer 6. This is going to be layer 6. Same thing up here. Layer 6, layer 6. And maybe there's a vine or 2 coming across here. And honestly, that's something I can figure out in a little bit. I don't really want to make my picture too complicated, even though it is looking pretty darn complicated right now. Something to have the students keep in mind is that they're going to always need to connect to the frame of the picture. It's really difficult to have free-floating elements. You can do it. I can walk through students through that process, but for the first time you're doing this, it's just easiest to have all these elements connecting to the edges. Once you've set the students off to figure out what stories they want to tell, you're really only going to need a couple of things. You're going to need paper, you're going to need a pencil, you're going to need an eraser. For the first class, the objective is to have 3 sketches, to choose one, and then to start breaking it down into layers. So that's the end of day 1. I do have a lot more footage that did not make it into this 10 minutes. So I'm going to hopefully eventually post a part 2. The part where I begin building up the layers is already on my YouTube channel. You can check that out. I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, you can contact me on Twitter for more information at Ms. Beam Art.